Our speaker is Dr. Mariah Liston. Dr. Liston is with the Anthropology and Classical departments of the University of Waterloo and holds her degrees from the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, Indiana University at Bloomington, an MA, and King College, a BA. She received her PhD from the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. Her areas of specialization are Greek archaeology, skeletal biology, and biological anthropology, paleopathology, and military and battlefield archaeology, which is why she is here and joining us today. She recently co-authored the Agora Bone Well, a study of a deposit containing 449 infant and fetal skeletons, probably deposited by midwives working in the Hellenistic Athens in Greece. Recently, she's also begun work on a well from the Swiss excavations at Eretria, and is also documenting skeletons from an early Christian cemetery found in the sanctuary of Ismenian Apollo in Thebes. So she is very, very busy indeed. She is also, the reason she's joining us today is that she is the Frederick and Margaret Matson Lecture Fellow. This fellowship was set aside by Frederick and Margaret B. Matson. This focuses in the Near Eastern archaeology area and world archaeological technology area. And it was established by a generous gift from the professors Matson, who have been lifelong friends of the Institute. A past president of the AIA, serving from 1975 to 1976, Frederick Matson served as professor emeritus at Pennsylvania State University, where he has had a long and illustrious career in the anthropology department. Margaret Matson, also at Penn State, retired from the sociology department and shares her husband's interest in Near Eastern archaeology and the work of the Institute. And so Dr. Liston is joining us today and serves as the lecturer, the Matson lecturer. And so with all of that, please join me in welcoming. You can do a digital round of applause if you'd like. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Liston, and I will stop sharing so that you can take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Deb. I'm so sorry I can't be there in person. We certainly tried, but it just wasn't to be. Thank you so much to all of you for coming. And I'm delighted to get to speak to you, even if it's a little more distance than I anticipated. So yes, what I want to talk about this evening is some of the evidence that we have for the Battle of Chaironeia in 338 BC. And this was one of those really monumental world-changing events. There, for a second, my slide wouldn't change. That was a little anxiety. This was when Phillip II of Macedon and his very young teenage son, Alexander, led the Macedonian forces in a battle against a united group of various city-states, primarily Greeks from Thebes, and on this map you can see Thebes down here, and from Athens, and then some other smaller city-states. And it was one of the last major attempts of the Greeks to resist the spread of the Macedonian power into mainland Greece. So Chaironeia is located here in central Greece on this long sort of peninsula of Greece. And as I said, Thebes is down here in the bottom of this Google Maps image. And Chaironeia is in part of the territory that was dominated by Thebes. You have the large plain of Boeotia, very important agricultural area even today. And Chaironeia guards one of the passes leaving the plain of Boeotia to the northwest. The battle itself is moderately well known, although given how important it was, it's a little surprising that we don't know a bit more about it. But we do have enough descriptions to understand what was going on. So you have here the highlands, including the acropolis of the city of Chaironeia here, and then this large, somewhat marshy plain, and the two battle groups were arrayed across that. So the two landmarks that we have today that are very clear are the Lion Monument, and what we'll be talking about is the Theban soldiers buried there at the Lion Monument. And then there is also the Macedonian polyandrion, burial mound, that until it was excavated in the 19th century was thought to be possibly as early as the Neolithic, but then they realized that in fact this is the burial place of the Macedonians who died in the battle. And so those 2 points are known, and then we have descriptions of the battle that allow us to figure out fairly well what was going on. So you had the Macedonians with Philip on the Macedonian right and Alexander with the cavalry on the Macedonian left. Facing them were the Athenians, more or less opposite the right of the Macedonians, and the Boeotians with the end anchored by the Theban Sacred Band. This specialized elite force of about 300 soldiers who were said to be pairs of lovers. And so you were fighting with someone that you cared for deeply. And it is said that the Macedonian burial mound is located where the battle turned, at an important turning point. And so it is believed that that is approximately where the Sacred Band and the Boeotian right would have been fighting. However, they are then buried here at the Lion, which is near or at the foot of the Acropolis of Chaironeia. So we've got the geography fairly well established. There are some questions, but the major layout of the battle is fairly well known. This is a picture taken from the Acropolis of Chaironeia, looking out over the battlefield in August, and the battle took place in August. And as you can see, it's pretty hazy and humid. It would have been a hot day and a difficult day to be fighting a battle on, but I think you can imagine that it potentially looked rather like this. The plain of Boeotia is very well watered, and in fact would be marshy and swampy if it were not cross-cut with canals. And so this very humid air would certainly be part of that. The two arrows here show, first of all, the Macedonian burial mound, which today has cypresses planted all over it. So it is here. And then the Lion Monument is just about here. You can't see it for the trees, but it's located about here. So this would have been the stretch across which the conflict was taking place. Like many of these ancient monuments, and particularly battlefield monuments, the lion that was built to mark the burial place of the Theban Sacred Band, or we believe it to be, there isn't a inscription saying so, but hopefully I can persuade you this is the Theban Sacred Band. It had been torn down in the medieval period. There were often these myths circulating that monuments like this held great treasure. And so many of them were torn down and broken up. And of course, there was no treasure in them. But this is the lion as initially uncovered. It had been largely covered with sediment. You can see there have been some major excavations, and part of the wall surrounding the burial place was recovered as well. But this is the lion before my restoration. There is a reconstructed drawing of the excavations. It was dug in sort of three phases. First of all, a small area was dug by a sculptor named Vitalis, who was responsible for the restoration of the Lion Monument and also building the big base that is there today. You may have seen it in my first slide, and we'll see him again. And there's actually no archaeological evidence for that base, unfortunately. But he dug a portion of 3 rows of skeletons, a total of about 25. And then a Greek archaeologist named Stamatakis excavated the entire burial and did not produce a drawing like this, but his notebook has little individual drawings of skeletons, and he numbers the rows and the skeletons. And so this is a reconstruction drawing of this. Excuse me. A total of 257 skeletons were uncovered. And if you remember, I said the Sacred Band was believed to have about 300 soldiers. Now, any military unit will have some variation in numbers, and not all of them will be available to fight at a given battle because of illness and injury and so forth. But the number 257 corresponds well to the historical evidence that the Theban Sacred Band was just wiped out at this battle. And in fact, they never recovered and they were never reconstituted by Thebes. The Sacred Band was an unusual group in the sense that they were much more like a professional military force than was typical in the ancient Greek world. The Greeks were, for the most part, farmer soldiers, and you were called up from your normal activities, but you were not professional soldiers. And there was relatively little training that went on after some sort of early training in young teenagers. But the Theban Sacred Band apparently was more professionalized, a bit more full-time, and better trained. And they were viewed as the most formidable fighting force in the ancient Greek world. But in fact, the Macedonians, and specifically probably Alexander with his cavalry, in fact slaughtered them. And they were killed almost to a man. The excavations, again, by Stamatakis, were done in the 19th century and were never fully published, although there are some descriptions by Stamatakis. And the diary or notebooks of those excavations is now being studied. There are actually a number of people looking at them, but I'm working with Peter Krentz and Michael Tomasu from Davidson College, who are working on translating and sort of interpreting and editing these notebooks so we can understand more about the excavations. The material was moved to Athens, possibly just before World War II, where a lot of material was moved around to try to protect it from being stolen by the Germans, and then was moved back to Chaironeia in the late 20th century. There is now an exhibit in the museum that shows some of this material, but when I saw the bones, they were actually still in the University of Athens. And I got to look at them in the library, which was sort of unusual, didn't have very good lighting. And I'm actually hoping to get a permit to get to examine these again in the Chaironeia Museum under somewhat better circumstances. But it was fun to get to see sort of, informal views of the material. So there were lots of these wooden crates of cups found with the burials. And then today they're on display in the museum. And in fact, this one little glossed black cup is the most decorative of all the ceramics I saw. And that same cup is here on display because it is sort of the most elaborate of them. There were a lot of metal objects in the grave, and we'll get to weapons here in a minute, but the most common thing were the Stridgels. The Stridgel was an ancient cleaning instrument. When you were all dirty and hot and sweaty, you would put olive oil on your body and then scrape it off with the curved blades of the Stridgel. And one of the things we're looking at is to see if every single soldier has a Stridgel with him. And it certainly is fairly close. This seems to be that this was something that nearly everyone was buried with and therefore would have owned. There are other things, various sorts of small knives. This is not a weapon. This is more of a kitchen knife, but something that a soldier was carrying in his kit and was buried with. There were also large quantities of these bone loops or circles, which honestly look astonishingly like Cheerios, the cereal. They're about the same size and shape for the most part, although there is some variation. They were interpreted initially as being somehow used in lacing up sandals. But in fact, in the drawings, it's clear that they're in long rows. And it looks like possibly they were sort of reinforcements for some sort of cloth or canvas that then was being used as shrouds to wrap the bodies. And that's one of the things we're trying to work on in analyzing these drawings. And so all of a sudden we've got a whole lot more research going on about this site, things that I wasn't aware of even a few months ago. So I've for years called these eyelets from sandals, and I left them labeled here in this image, but we're revisiting that interpretation now. It was sort of interesting in some of the boxes of them. I mean, here were 3 human teeth mixed in with them. People certainly got their teeth knocked out in a battle, and some of them were apparently collected in the excavation. Whether they had fallen out of the skulls after they were buried or in fact were knocked out in the battle is not quite clear yet. But then there are other things as well. And I do want to point out this object right here that I got to see in the library. And here it is on display with some of these bone eyelets, whatever they are. That is a spindle whorl. It is used to spin fibers into thread. And it is almost always identified very strongly as a marker of a female grave. If you find a spindle whorl in a grave, therefore it must be a female's grave. You don't need to ask the anthropologist about the sex of the bones because it's got a spindle whorl. Well, in fact, objects don't have genes, and they don't cause, sex identification in humans. And here, in fact, is a spindle whorl buried in what is very clearly a battlefield grave. And that was an area of activity in the ancient Greek world that was pretty much limited to men. And we have no evidence for anything but male burials here. So anyway, if you're ever excavating graves, don't assume you know who's buried there based on the grave goods. But then because this was a battlefield site, there are a lot of weapons. There are actually 2 different sets of weapons. These are from the Macedonian polyandrion. And these are Macedonian type spears, as well as a sword fragment on display today as well. The weapons from the Lion Monument have not yet been cleaned and restored as much. And so you can see they're quite rusty here, obviously made of iron. You have both spear points, and they are a bit different. Notice the Theban ones are a bit shorter and wider, while the Macedonians are more elongated and very prone to breaking, in fact, because they are so long and thin, but would be very effective and easier to embed in a human body, which of course was their point. At the other end of a spear, you would have another point. It's called a spear butt spike, or the Greeks called it a sauroteres, which is a lizard sticker. Apparently they harassed poor little lizards with these things, but this would allow you to embed the back end, the butt end of your spear in the ground without dulling or damaging the spear point. But you can embed it in the ground, lean your shield against it, just have it standing there, so you don't have to hold it all the time. And I suggested early on that these could also be used as a secondary weapon. If you break your spear point, then the other end still has a point on it. And I had someone very sternly caution me that no, that was not a weapon. It was a practical part of the spear, and it provided some weight balance, which it certainly would, but it would never be used as a weapon. And I'm going to show you pretty good evidence that, in fact, they were used as weapons. They're distinguished from the blades because often they're more or less square in cross section or round, but square is quite common, and then tapering to a point. And they often have a little flange or collar around them so that if you're embedding it in soft soil, it will stop at a certain point. And we have some evidence for that I'll show you as well. The Greek hoplites and the Macedonian hoplites are named in part for their shield, the hoplon, the round shield. That's sort of the distinguishing bit of armor. In earlier times, soldiers who at least were wealthy enough would have a much more complete set of armor, which might include a bronze helmet, a breastplate, and then greaves to protect the shins. And your shield would protect anything that wasn't being covered with metal in this way. The problem with all of this is that it's heavy and it definitely limits movement. And in particularly on a hot day in August, would be really debilitating very quickly. And so as time went along, Greek weaponry evolved. It became lighter. They began to use reinforced glued leather much more than the bronze, particularly for the body armor and the helmet. We're going to see some pottery images of the earlier sort of classical period Greek helmets that have these enormous horsehair crests and such on them. By this time, those had largely disappeared. They also would be pretty impractical. They would be hard on your head and neck to carry that weight. They were impressive, but not terribly practical. And so by this point, most soldiers would be wearing the pilos style helmet, which is much plainer, just sort of a rounded cap, either of metal, in the case of this one in the image, or very often, again, of the multiple layers of glued reinforced leather. Not quite as strong, but infinitely more practical to wear in battle, and still providing a fair amount of protection. The images that we have of ancient warfare, I think, or the images we carry in our head, are probably influenced strongly by artistic images, and particularly things like ceramic vases that have wonderful detail. But we have to remember that this is an artistic representation of battle, and it's pretty, and it's symmetrical, and it's tidy, and it's neat. And that is not at all what two lines of men doing everything they can to kill each other is like. And so warfare was a whole lot more brutal than the sort of images that we see in the ceramics. Things go wrong. And you do get things represented like this. For example, this wonderful Lekathos. Here you have a soldier. Now, his first mistake is he's fighting Athena, which is never a good idea. But his spear has, in fact, broken. He probably hit her shield. It broke in the middle, as would happen. You apply force on two ends of a long piece of wood, and it often breaks in the middle. He's now drawn his sword, but clearly Athena's about to catch him in the ribs with her spear. So it's not that we don't have some evidence of the more messy, gory aspects of battle, but in fact, the historic descriptions in the ceramics don't give us as good a sense as the bones can give us. As we start looking at these bones, I also want to talk a little bit, those were images of Greeks. I want to talk a little bit about what we know about Macedonian warfare as well. We do know that the Macedonians later under Alexander developed cavalry as an offensive weapon in warfare in a way that had never been done before. Prior to the Macedonians, cavalry were used both to take high status soldiers to the battlefield, but they would then dismount and fight on foot, or they were used as messengers, or they would be used to sort of clean up after a battle, chasing down fleeing soldiers and so forth. But actually within the battle, fighting against a phalanx of these hoplites, it had not been developed effectively. And that one of the big questions about the Battle of Chaironeia is whether or not Alexander had already, presumably working with his father, but was already using the cavalry in this very effective way in this, one of his first major battles. We have later images of Alexander fighting on horseback. The most famous is probably the mosaic from the House of the Faun at Pompeii, which is believed to be a copy of an earlier painting, probably on wooden panels. And so you have Alexander, his somewhat distressed looking horse, fighting in a battle. The so-called Alexander sarcophagus, which is in the Archaeological Museum in Istanbul, also gives us good evidence. Now, it's not Alexander sarcophagus because we believe Alexander was buried in it, but because they're images. And in fact, here you have Alexander fighting on horseback using a spear, and his horse has actually just been stabbed as well. But so we do have images of the use of the spears on horseback by the Macedonians. But I think it's also important to look at other blade weapons in Macedonian art. And as I began to work with these bones and then looking at images of Macedonian art, I was struck by how often what we see is this overhand use of bladed weapons. In this case, an axe and a sword going after this poor deer. Here's another soldier fighting again with the overhand sword movement. And in fact, on the Alexander sarcophagus, another one of the Macedonians who is mounted here fighting the barbarians. Notice here, his hand is over his head, not in the way you'd hold a spear, but in fact is clearly aiming a blow at the head of this individual. Presumably with a sword. The sword would have been a separate metal piece. So I thought that was interesting, and you'll see why when we start looking at some of the skulls. We do have a lot of evidence that helps us address some of these questions. I hope I brought up clearly as we've been going through this. So first of all, in terms of looking at the age of the individuals, now I was not able to study all of the bones. Not all of them were they were all uncovered, but not all of them were removed in the 19th century excavations. As far as we can tell, most of these individuals are still there, buried around the Lion Monument. So what we have are what a 19th century excavator thought looked interesting. And so it's definitely a non-random sample. But what we do know is that they're all approximately the right age. They're all adults, and none of them are terribly old. Some of them may be as much as 35 or so, and the youngest around 20. We can tell this from things like their wisdom teeth have erupted, the third molars. In nearly every case, well, in every case I've seen, their third molars have erupted. So they're over roughly 18 years of age. Some individuals are old enough they've actually lost teeth. Now, what you have here is a skull that still has some of the soil that was encasing it in around the skull. It was lifted together and I wasn't allowed to clean it. But you're looking here at the mandible, the lower jaw, and this person has lost all of his molars long before death, and the bone has resorbed and closed up. The cranial sutures, which are these little lines that connect the plates of the skull, some of them were open, but some of them are beginning to close and even disappear and obliterate. And you can see how faint this is. That's a marker of someone who's probably in their 30s or 40s. Cranial suture closure is very uneven and not terribly consistent, but young individuals normally will all have all the sutures open. And then in the 30s, roughly, they begin to obliterate like this. So again, the evidence suggests they're the right age to be soldiers. In addition, every indication, both on the skulls and the long bones, indicates that they are male. All of the samples I was able to view. I mean, they have things like very square chins rather than the more pointed chins of females. They have large brow ridges. Just the whole morphology of the face, which is a fairly good marker of sex, is male. The bones that I could measure fall more within male range than female range and so forth. There were no pelvic bones. None of the innominates or os cocci were recovered. And that, unfortunately, is the best bone for estimating sex. But the skull is quite good. And again, every indication is these are young males and nothing else. This is not a village cemetery. I mean, we knew that already, the fact that they were all laid out in that mass grave format. But again, reinforcing and supporting the idea that this is a battle cemetery. While we think these are elite soldiers, it doesn't mean that they are completely buffered from, sort of the insults and stresses of growing up in the ancient world. Quite a few of them have evidence of stress in childhood, what's called linear enamel hypoplasias. These are grooves that form in dental enamel when a child is either quite sick, often with a high fever, or malnourished during childhood. Now, because of the lighting situation, when I was able to see these bones, I couldn't capture photographs of these lines. So this is, in fact, a mandible from the Athenian agora, but it shows you the kind of lines that you get. Those horizontal grooves on the teeth are these growth arrest markers indicating stress in childhood. And you can see here from my inventory sheet from Chaironeia, this individual just has, all of the anterior teeth are showing these. So they were elite soldiers, but they were not completely protected from stress in childhood. Their dental health is fairly typical of the ancient world, meaning not great. This individual has an abscess here around the root, would have lost that molar fairly quickly, probably. Here's a tooth that's been totally destroyed by a caries or cavity. It's the second one of the bicuspids or premolars. So again, bad dental health. This individual, interestingly, had a severe case probably of otitis media, a middle ear infection, which spread into the surrounding bone and resulted in an infection called mastoiditis. Before the advent of antibiotics, this was a pretty common infection in children and sometimes adults. When it spreads into the bone like this, it generally means that the hearing has largely been destroyed. There's so much damage to the bony portion of the ear. So this individual had, at one point, would have had a large abscess draining here behind their ear. By the time they died, it had healed. But the evidence is still there in this large cavity in the bone. So again, not perfect health. And this individual unquestionably would have been deaf in one ear. But it's the perimortem trauma, of course, we're primarily interested in. There are, for example, a lot of cranial fractures. Now here, this again is the way I got to see the skulls. I've tilted it up so it's more into a normal position, but the skull was actually lifted in a sort of plaster collar that you can see here. But what's happened with this individual is the face has been sort of pushed up underneath the brain case. And that's not the way skulls normally fall apart in the ground. It was really quite striking how different the arrangement of the bones was here. And I would suggest that this individual has been hit in the face with something heavy, like, for example, the rim of a shield. And it's driven his face back, fracturing most of the bones. And that would cause enough bleeding in the brain case for this to be a mortal wound. So these fracture lines here on the face are along planes that you have weakness in the bones, and they're called Lefort fractures. And this is a Lefort 1 fracture. It's the least severe. It's where you get a break in the cheekbone on each side of the nose. This, however, is a Lefort 3 fracture, where essentially you have a separation of the face from the skull through these fractures. And then there's also a perimortem mandible fracture too. But Lefort 3 fractures are often fatal even today, even with access to a trauma center. They're very common in automobile accidents where you have unrestrained passengers. So being thrown into the windshield or to the dashboard of a car is a fairly common way to get a Lefort 3 fracture. And again, they're quite often fatal. So the public service message here is wear your seatbelts, because you don't want this kind of fracture. Other things are less spectacular, but no less devastating. And what I show this You've noticed that there were lots of breaks on that previous drawing, some of which I drew red lines through and some I didn't. And that's because I'm sorting out what are the perimortem fractures, where you've got fractures in green, fresh, wet bone versus postmortem fractures that are in dry bone. And the difference is very much like breaking a stick or a branch on a tree. If it's dry and dead, it snaps cleanly and goes right straight through. If it's wet and green and living or recently living, then you get this uneven fracture that doesn't go straight through the fibers, but instead it's sort of an angle. Well, bone has collagen fibers that run through it. And when living bone or very recently dead bone is broken, you don't get that even sort of right angle break. You get a beveled break like this. And so this is a fairly classic appearance of a perimortem fracture. You'll see in many of these slides, I include a drawing of a skull like this, and it will show you what you're looking at. And so this is the top of the skull. You can see the nose peeking out right there. And so this is a fracture here along the coronal suture here. You've got the sagittal suture there. And this probably was a direct blow here, creating this beveled fracture in this bone fragment. Here we have a penetrating wound, something that was stabbed into the skull. And this is the evidence I have for the spear butt spike or the sauroteres being used as a weapon. It's located here, sort of in the back left quadrant of the skull. We're going to see the skull again because there's also a big cut mark right there. But what you have here is roughly a square cross section. And around it, there is an area where the bone has been crushed. So it's been impacted and it's collapsed from the force. And both of these are perimortem injuries. What I'm showing you here is one of these spear butt spikes. It's actually in the Acropolis Museum collections. And you've got the square cross section very clearly. And then a soldier at some point has weighted this with lead. It's got this rather rough lump of lead on this otherwise rather elegant bronze spear point. But that would have, again, be sort of like the flange, or again, the weight would be a counterweight to the spear point on the other end. And so if you stabbed into someone's head and then have either a flange like this, and sometimes they're a bit larger, or a weight like that, you would get this sort of impact around the hole. And that's what you've got here. And so I think this is very clear evidence of the spear butt spikes being used as weapons, because that's not a blade, that's a penetrating spike into the skull. I also want to point out that sometimes trauma on bones that looks rather insignificant on the bone itself, you have to remember that bones are covered in soft tissue, and that a very small injury to a bone can represent a devastating injury to the individual. So here we're looking at this bone fragment of the occipital, the back of the skull, and I've got the fragment outlined here, and there's this little cut mark. It's about the size of a dime. It's very clear that a blade entered here and sliced down, and then a chip or fragment broke off of the bone. Not all that impressive. But you think about the fact this is the back of the skull, and that blade continued moving down into the tissue, the muscles, the ligaments, the blood vessels of the neck. This could very well have been a fatal wound as that blade continued down into this individual's neck. So small evidence on the bone, but devastating consequences for the individual. And then finally, there is a collection of really interesting blade wounds made with long, heavy blades of some sort, presumably a sword. These are not stabbing wounds. These weren't done with spear points. These were done, again, with long, substantial blades, such as those Macedonian swords. Here you've got two individuals. Here's the location. It's on the top of the skull, this one running across the skull, this one running lengthwise. And this is, in fact, the one that also the skull had the spear butt spike hole. What you've got when you look at the bone itself is the cut here, but then notice there's this curved fracture adjacent to it. When force hits a skull, it moves out in a circle, sort of like ripples in a pond, until the bone fails at a slightly weaker point. And these are called concentric fractures. And what we have here is an unusual combination of a cut, so a blade wound, but the bone is also reacting as if it were blunt force trauma, as if it were hit with a club. And so that indicates it's a very heavy blow, tremendous force that is not only cutting the bone, but also breaking the bone in this curve. In this case, you don't get that concentric fracture. There's just the blade cut. But then on the inside, in both of these cases, the force, the table of the skull has an inner and outer layer and then sort of a spongy layer in between. And force moves out through it in a conical shape. We see this later with bullet wounds where the entry is small, and then on the inner table of the skull, it's a larger hole because that force is spreading out in a cone. Well, we're getting the same thing here with these blade wounds, where you're getting a wider beveled fracture on the inside of the skull. You can see it here. In fact, there's that exposed diploe or spongy bone, and here as well. So again, it's this really unusual combination of a blade wound plus the reaction like blunt force trauma, which again indicates tremendous force hitting these skulls. And then again, I noted that you've got the blade wound and then the penetrating spike wound that we've seen before. So this person, either one of these would have been fatal wounds. But for some reason, they wanted to be very sure this individual was dead. This one is the most terrible trauma I've ever seen in any skeleton. You've got a blade wound that hit the front forehead, sort of just over the left eye socket, but it traveled down behind the eyes and down into the lower face. It actually nicks the mandible down here. So that blade passed behind the face, slicing off his face. Here you see that the skull is a hole with that frontal fragment. Here's the blade wound all the way down with that fragment removed. And then here it is as I found it sort of lying on the skull. So again, this is essentially an amputation of the face with a blade. And again, would take tremendous force to do this. There were also some leg bones that were collected that had rather impressive cut marks on them. Here you see them in the tray as I first saw them. Here is a femur. You've got a slice and then a chip. It did enough damage that there then is a post-mortem break through the bone, but that has nothing to do with the battle. This is the wound. If you've ever chopped wood with an axe or a hatchet, you're very familiar with this phenomenon of the blade cuts, but it also breaks. And so you get the slice and the chip, and that's exactly what you're seeing here. It's on the outer surface of the femur, about 6 inches above the knee. Here is a tibia or shin bone, and down here just above the ankle, again, there has been a slice that went almost all the way through the bone, but then you've got this kind of jagged break, which is a postmortem break. And the adjacent piece was recovered with the bone. So you've got the cut here, and you can see that clearly here. Here's another tibia or shin, and in this case, it's sort of in the middle of the shin, and this one's very unusual. There are actually 3 blows, 1, 2, 3, that have dug into this bone. I don't think this possibly could have happened in battle. no matter how tough the Theban Sacred Band were, they aren't going to stand there while somebody's chopping at their shins like they're trying to chop down a tree. I think this may be some evidence of some post-mortem mutilation, attempt to remove the lower legs or feet, which sounds odd, but I'm about to show you 2 cases of that, or there are potentially 2 cases. So I don't quite understand this wound, and I'm not convinced it took place during the active part of the battle on a living soldier, because I don't know how you would land 3 blows in the exact same place like this. I mentioned the feet. Here is one of the pairs of feet. They were lifted in a block of cement, and you can see very clearly severed right through the tibia and fibula. And then here was another pair of feet, although they were in 2 separate plaster blocks. And you can see again, there's the tibia, there's the fibula. This one's in much worse shape, but the 2 bones are there. So for some reason, feet are being severed. I don't know if this was trophy taking. That's a possibility, but then they decided to abandon them, because honestly, a pair of feet in August would get nasty pretty quickly. I don't know what's going on here. There would be certainly easier ways to kill a soldier than cutting off their feet, easier ways to ensure they will never fight you again. And the literature is pretty much silent on this. I don't understand what's going on with this, but for some reason, these bodies are being mutilated, feet are being cut off. And again, I think we've got another case of someone who perhaps had not quite so heavy a blade or wasn't as good at using it and failed to sever that tibia with the 3 blows. So when we look at the accumulation, the set of all the damage to the skeletons that I have, you can see I've got a collection of wounds on the skull, collection of wounds on the legs. There's nothing here in the middle. Now, if you think about the hoplite shield, that in fact is just the area that would be protected. But I have to also note that none of those bones were recovered. I fully expect a lot of the ribs would have had stab wounds, but stab wounds on ribs, even in relatively fresh bodies or fresh skeletons, can be hard to see. I've worked on a number of forensic cases that were stabbing deaths, and you've got to look carefully to catch them. The ribs can separate enough that the blades don't necessarily do that much damage. You find little tiny nicks, but not gaping cut marks. So it may simply be that Stamatakis and his crew didn't see wounds that were that impressive. They do note in the notebooks that the preservation of the ribs and vertebrae is quite poor as well. They could see where they were, but they weren't well preserved. So in this case, absence of evidence may not be evidence of absence. I think there would have been body and trunk wounds, but they're not well enough preserved, and certainly weren't for 19th century individuals without the knowledge of forensics and study of skeletons and such to pick up on them. But I do find it interesting that if you put all of the, sort of major armor, the helmet and the shield and the greaves on, there's only one cut mark, that one on the femur, that would not be protected by armor potentially on these individuals. The patterning in the wounds to the skull, I think, is important, and I think it helps us address this question of how involved were cavalry fighters in defeating the Theban Sacred Band. This is a compilation of all the major wounds to the skull, and I've showed you a lot of these. There's the face amputation. Here's that little tiny nick to the back of the skull, but what I think was fairly devastating. And some of the cut marks here on top, the fracture, and in fact, that penetrating wound as well. You can see they're clustered more or less on top of the skull, with the exception of this one toward the back of the skull. When we compare that to another blade battle much later, but the Battle of Toten, which is part of the War of the Roses in England, what we have here is a battle that the historical documentation is it was two groups of soldiers all on foot. The cavalry didn't make it to the battle until it was over. And so this was men with blades killing each other, standing, facing, fighting each other. And you'll notice that the bulk of the blows are to the sides of the skull. Again, this is a compilation of all the blade wounds from that battle. There is one right up here on top. There's the same one there. This one on the forehead, but the bulk of the blades are on the sides of the skull. And so I was really struck by the fact that at Chaironeia, nearly all the blade wounds are on top of the skull, which suggests to me the attackers are somehow higher than the soldiers of the Theban Sacred Band who are being attacked. And of course, the one way that could happen would be that if you have mounted soldiers on horseback fighting foot soldiers. Ancient horses weren't tremendous. It wouldn't have gotten them way up in the air, but it certainly would have elevated them above the height of hoplite soldiers on the ground. And I think that's how you could strike these blows so consistently to the top of the head, which are so unusual in other battles. I only show you this one, but I've worked on prehistoric North American massacre sites. Same thing, the cut marks are all around the sides of the head, and other battles as well. This is the only one where the blows are on top. And so there's some disparity between the two forces, and one group is up in the air and the other one isn't. And I think here we've got evidence of Alexander and the cavalry. If we also think about the artistic evidence of this overhand use of bladed weapons that we see in the sarcophagus and the mosaics from Pella and so forth, I think that's how you would get this astonishing amount of force that is not just cutting skulls, but it's breaking skulls. And it's doing it with enough force that you're getting the same sort of beveling that we see in modern gunshot wounds. This is unusual. This is a tremendous amount of force hitting the skull to create this beveling effect. And I think the only way you'd get that is from above, and then with this overhand blow, using the sword almost like a club, but a club that has a blade on it. And so I think the evidence suggests that, in fact, teenage Alexander was already managing and strategizing and using these cavalry, in the way that he later becomes very famous for and so incredibly effective at. But here in the Battle of Chaironeia, I think he is already using the cavalry against hoplites in a way that no one else had ever done before. So sorry, I should have given you the slide for that summary. I do think the Macedonian cavalry under Alexander was instrumental in winning this battle, and in particularly in slaughtering the Theban Sacred Band, this nearly undefeatable group of highly trained hoplite soldiers. And of the 300, at least 256 died in this battle. So today, the reconstructed lion sits here above the cemetery. This wall represents that ancient wall, the bounds of the burials. So you can see it's not a tremendously large area. And as far as we can tell, most of the soldiers, except for the ones I've showed you tonight, are still buried here today. And I thank you for your attention. I need to acknowledge all the people who have given me access and also their wisdom in talking about ancient battle, both cavalry and hoplite warfare.